Welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road Podcast. I'm your host, Chris, alongside my co host, Dean. And joining today's show, we are welcoming back a familiar voice, Heidi. And for today's show, we're going to dive into the topic of cults. How are you doing today, Heidi? Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be back. How are y'all?
We're pretty good. We're just trying to figure out a way to approach this really complicated topic. And like we said, Chris said, we're going to talk about cults and cultisms because Heidi, you have some, unfortunately, growing up, you've had some experience with that. People like you are so fascinating to talk to because you have both sides of the spectrum. You did experience that directly. So you have an outside perspective as well as an inside perspective.
Yeah, we can start off with like a general definition of what a cult is. So it's essentially a subsect of a religion led by either one charismatic leader or multiple people. Essentially, they just control everything. They tell you what to do, what to wear, what you can and can't do.
Yeah, but I'm looking at another definition as well. And one thing they throw out there that differentiates between an organized religion and what Chris was saying and an actual cult is that it seems like cults rely heavily on secret knowledge, special knowledge that's only revealed through certain aspects or integrations within that level. Like Chris said, there's usually a leader and there are some chosen representatives, and they're the ones who seemingly have the divine knowledge that people are trying to get access to, but they're really coveting it and holding on to it. And the only way to get closer to it, seemingly, to the people on the outside is if they become more embedded, more devout. And I think that's where it spirals into a cult.
So is that why you bought a Tesla, Dean?
Tesla.
You got caught in the cult of Elon.
Tesla.
But yeah, the cult I was in started out benignly. It was called the Institute in Basic Life Principles. It was founded by Bill Gothard in Chicago in the 1970s. And he started it as an outreach to kids in the juvenile criminal system, just to, not even like as a religious thing at all, just to go in and make sure that, everyone in there was getting education. And then that turned into, let's teach you some character, because obviously you need it. You're in jail and you're a kid. And then that turned into a cult.
How did you end up getting involved with this?
So my aunt and uncle, my mother's oldest brother and his wife, somehow stumbled into this, I think in the very early 80s, kind of when it was just taking off. It was taking off as a homeschooling movement at that point because of the literature that Bill Gothard created and put out called wisdom booklets. He stressed had to be taught at home. And the reason why kids were growing up and becoming criminals is because of all the evil influences that were in the world, the secular world, up to and including rock music, like literally the beat of rock music going against the natural beat of your heart and will cause you to have a heart attack early in life, like shit like that. So my aunt and uncle got involved in the early 80s. They were the only ones, and they ended up having 4 kids and homeschooling them all, and all of their kids were in the cult. But at some point in my childhood, my dad and I and my sister ended up moving to Michigan from Colorado, and we just lived closer to them. And it was fun to go hang out with my cousins on the weekend, like anyone would. They were my cousins. It was fun. And so I'd go over to hang out, and then they invited me to church, and I was like, yeah, okay. And I went, and it was weird. It was like, ugh, this is weird. Like Catholic was. I went to a Catholic church. I thought that was weird, how much we had to like kneel and stuff. But we, I went, and it was fine. There was like a potluck after, and there's a big barn that we played in. I mean, we just played for hours. I think I was 10. I was just a kid. It was so much fun, and it was that brought me back. They're like, you can come back anytime. I was like, yeah, this is a blast. My dad was like, oh, there's no harm in you going to church. He didn't go with me, but so that is how it began.
So they kind of lured you in very early.
Definitely. And then immediately, is like all of the brainwashing started.
You mind going into the brainwashing aspect? So, like, what are certain things that they would tell you as a kid to make you keep coming back? I know you just said they were, you could play around in a barn. They had all these fun activities to do. While you were doing those activities, did they try to instill a certain
Yes,
doctrine in you?
for sure. Oh, yeah. The wisdom booklets. And my aunt as well, she was really a real leader in this, but she was like, you can't come back and hang out with my kids if you're not going to go to church. I didn't understand that at all. That didn't make sense to me. I was like 10, whatever. And I was like, okay, whatever. I'll go to church if that's what it takes to hang out with my cousin. And we grew up like brother and sister, best friends, get along like peas and carrots even to this day. It was like that. And then it was really my aunt that did a lot of the indoctrination. But when you were, Dean, mentioning at the top of the show how a cult is really defined by like a secret knowledge or access to resource, or especially knowledge, that is also an IBLP. That was the they called them the basic seminar and then the advanced seminar. So, and then they were very exclusive. Like when my aunt and uncle took my sister in, when they took her in for a little while, and they got booted out of the cult officially, the Advanced Training Institute. They got booted out because you were not allowed to adopt children and or bring in even your own like family. You were not allowed to fold them in if they needed you, because that was considered a threat to your own family unit. And my aunt and uncle were like, I don't know. She's our family. I mean, good on them for that, but they still continued to go to the church and everything and teach all the principles.
So there's two questions I want to get into, and I apologize. They can go deep, but like we could feel free to explore each one. But the first one, when you were there as a kid, even as a kid, which I think you can argue that there are a lot of kids. I know my daughter is a good example where even at like a young age, they know right from wrong. They know that something is off, right? Even if it's a little bit imagined, right? Like they just see that there's a difference of normality around them, and it gives them some pause and caution. So my question to you is, when you were playing and having fun with your friends, did you ever notice anything that was off about the situation? Like something just didn't sit right? And like, when did that happen? And can you explain, like, did it snowball, or was it kind of all at once? Or like, did you kind of just bury it down and not ignore it? Or like, maybe talk about that a little bit?
Definitely there were. And just real quick to swing back to Chris's, like the beginning of his other question, how did they brainwash us? They would teach us, and then they would say, that now you've heard this now. If you choose not to believe it and go against it, you are choosing to be, you are choosing to turn your back to God. And they would have children's seminars, children's institutes, and we would go. And my dad, he was, didn't really know what the fuck this was when we first got up there. And so he's like, we both went. He attended the basic seminar, and I went to the children's institute. And I mean, it was a huge room with hundreds and hundreds of kids sitting, and they taught us songs and then taught us the 10 unchangeables, which are your gender and your family and your, birth order and whatever. They were all songs that they would teach us in order to, and that's how they indoctrinated. Or seeing this is weird for sure. Like immediately it was so weird that everybody was homeschooled. I had never even heard of that before. When my dad and I moved to Michigan to be up there with my sister, and she was living with my aunt and uncle at the time, I had never, ever even heard the word homeschool. So that was weird. And then the other thing was that all of the women and all of the girls, they all wore skirts and dresses only, period. And they were long. Almost none of them cut their hair. And I was like, you don't wear pants? Like, how do you do anything? And what it was is they would wear culottes, is what they called them, which are just really, really super, super wide leg, like fabric shorts that are very, 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 very long as a skirt.
You brought something up that sparked a memory, because for me, I have experience with Christian fundamentalists. I remember that one time I was told that, if you choose to follow
I'm sorry, Dean. Wait, what?
I told you this story. Okay, so just yeah, for everyone's edification, I grew up. So I'll start from the beginning really briefly. I grew up Catholic like Chris. There was a brief moment in my life where I tried to explore Christian faith deeper because in my mentality when I was younger, it was like, oh, well, I chose to be Christian when I was younger, or like I was brought into Christianity and then I chose to be Christian or keep at it. So I went to church on my own and stuff. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to be Christian, I might as well be Christian all the way. Like that was just my mentality before I opened my mind and explored different ways of thinking and exposed to education and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that on a deeper level, like a collegiate level. If you remember, Chris, when we first started hanging out, I was still part of that mentality, trying to explore it when we were going to Catholic university. So I would like pray over my food, I would do stuff like that. But even before that, when I was going to a different university before I transferred over, I had hung out with these kids or this group of kids they didn't call themselves fundamentalists, but they were clearly like very, very strict Christian. They followed everything. I even think some of them didn't buy that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old, which I never prescribed to that.
Yeah, that's what we
You believe
believe.
that, right?
We believe that.
Yeah, yeah.
They taught us. Yeah, they taught us that. I had to
An
attend an
entire
entire
geological discussion about as a side
yes,
note, there was
yes.
do you guys remember a few years ago there was Bill Nye the Science Guy debated with that ultra religious guy on stage about like evolution and the age of the universe and stuff like that. Did you guys watch that?
He built like a theme park called the Holy Land or something like that.
Yes.
Great comfort.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
used to watch him a lot.
It was very clear to me. So some of you guys listening might have a difference of opinion, but it was very clear to me in the first 10 minutes that Bill Nye was owning that dude. Anyway, I just remember that like one thing that Bill Nye said was like, I'm sorry, did the birds do something to sin? Like, did they do something to deserve like eternal fire and death? It was like some part of the conversation. Anyway, that just sticks out from that conversation. But going back to what I experienced hanging out for a brief time, I think it was maybe only like 5 or 6 months. I hung out with this group of kids, and it, like, to me, it wasn't a cult, but to me, it was also what you experienced, Heidi, where you immediately get like, this doesn't really sit right. The things they're saying and the things they're talking about. It's like, oh, Buddha is burning in a lake of fire. People who follow other religions are already damned because even if they heard the name Jesus, that was their one chance to be saved, and they chose to turn away from that. And it's just like, okay, just go along with it at first, and then you kind of feel uneasy, and then it's extremely scary because you're talking about what might be potentially your eternal soul. And what might potentially happen to you after this life forever. That is a heavy concept for anybody of any age, let alone children.
And it's not like your parents were like, oh, this is bad, Dean, don't listen to that. Your parents were like, it's cool, we're Christians, that's cool. And so you're like, it's scary, but my parents are okay with it.
What drives a lot of these people to become more subscribed into a cult-like faith is out of fear. And I know it's kind of religion in general. Like, a lot of people are driven by fear in their actions, but especially like those who are in a cult, they psychologically subscribe so deeply because they don't want to admit it. But what they're honestly trying to do really is they're trying to do the right thing that keeps them from burning in a lake of fire forever. Like that's really like, that's at the very crux of every action they take. That's really what's motivating them for real. Like am I doing the right thing to avoid that lake of fire?
And that's all predicated on the belief that there is a lake of fire too. You're immediately free from that. If you just think, what if there isn't a hell? What if there isn't a lake of fire? What if this is just bullshit?
And also my mentality on that as well is if there is a lake of fire, or if there is some truth to that's based off of like, if you don't follow this certain religion, doesn't have to be Christianity, but if you don't follow X religion in the exact Y way, you're going to end up in whatever hell or whatever. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's like, you can't really do anything about that anyway. One of the arguments Christianity has, like ultimate fundamentalist Christianity, is, oh, well, why would you gamble with your eternal soul? Why would you just not follow it to protect yourself? But then my argument would be, well, what if there's another religion you don't know about that you're not following?
They say that as they sniff coke and bang hookers on Saturday.
Did you guys ever see
go to church on Sunday?
Did you ever see the Royal Gemstones? It's such a great show, Chris. If
Yes.
you so Heidi saw it, but Chris, if you haven't seen The Royal Gemstones with Danny McBride, he's one of my favorite all-time comedic actors. But like, it's such a
Yeah,
great show.
he's
He was the
great.
dude who did Eastbound and Down. But yes, like
Mhm.
if you get a chance, everyone, like, yeah, please watch
Wonderful.
Royal Gemstones.
To circle back real quick, Dean, when you were talking about these people using the quote unquote lake of fire as damnation, here's my gripe with cults and these type of people in general, because literally they like to pick and choose verses to enforce their rules.
This is all assuming that the Bible is real and that it's true. And it's, you study one religion, you're hooked for life. You study two, and you're done in 10 minutes. You know, it's all of it is assuming that Christianity is real and true. And, you know, that is the initial buy-in. You have to buy into that in order to be led
Yeah,
anywhere.
I think those are two very, very smart points, because so to Chris's point, I think one of the major issues with having a religious text in general is that it can be misquoted.
Mhm.
And this goes, I mean, this is going way too deep, but I'll just touch on it for a brief second. It really goes down to free will versus what is already scripted. If there is a divine script that's going on, that's playing out, it's either, to me, it's either one or the other. And if someone has the free will in a religion to choose text to weaponize it against people who they know are going to believe it, some people are going to believe it inevitably because it's out of fear or whatever. Then that seems like it's free will. But if it's not free will, if there's some kind of divine intervention, like they're quoting, like, oh, God is telling me to say this to people or quote this specific verse at this specific time, could be true, could not be true, maybe. But like at the same time, it's like there's some kind of action that's happening and we don't know in that moment, or the people listening to it don't know in that moment what is actually going on. Is it free will? Is it, or is it the person telling me, or is it the God telling me through this person? Just the sheer fact that we humans don't have a knowledge to that level about what's actually happening at the most basic form, that in of itself makes it almost unfair. But then to Heidi's point, it's like, well, we don't even know if Christianity is real in general. It could be that Buddhism got it right. It could be that, Hinduism, maybe there really are thousands of gods who are controlling everything, or maybe there is no God and there's just a functionality of the universe, this equilibrium. It's almost unfair in a way, right? Like from our vantage point, it's like, how can we be inundated with so many different perspectives and be exposed to so many falls and dangers?
What you said about free will and it being scripted, I have such a hard time with the scripting theory. I just can't accept it. One, like I said, I'm Catholic because my mom's Catholic. I grew up Catholic. My grandparents were Hindu. My cousins are Muslim. Some of my cousins by marriage are Jewish. My other cousin is a devout Hindu. And essentially, to me, this is going to probably piss off people listening to this. The basic principle is don't be a fucking dick. Don't control people. Be a good person. Be charitable. I don't understand why is that so fucking hard for people to grasp. I know we're getting away from the topic of cults and stuff because we kind of went down a rabbit hole with trying to understand how these people weaponize and rationalize religious texts. But like,
Chris, it sounds like you're ready to start your own cult.
Because
well, and have either one of you ever
the cult of being fucking normal?
Have you ever heard this
I'm sorry,
song
Heidi, go ahead.
By Bo Burnham called
Yes.
God's Perspective? From the perspective,
that's such a great one.
That's a
See, I don't find Bo Burnham
I love Bo
funny.
Burnham.
His humor.
He is so smart, but
I can't do the piano monotone.
You got to
voice
listen to
type
the
thing.
context
I've
of
tried
his
so
voice,
many
not the
times,
piano, not the monotone. It's the context of the words.
he makes some good points in that song, though. He really does. Like, he really does. And also, I mean, it's called the King James Version for a reason. King James, it's his version. There was a real King James, and he really did take and just put together a religious text. And isn't it interesting how it encourages the poor to be submissive to their authority, even the slaves. And it talks about you should give unto Caesar what is owed unto Caesar. Like, why? Why? Pay your taxes. You're paying me dear
Exactly. And
money.
this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the perfect segue back into the discussion of cultism. And it's talking about people who are trying to organize a certain following where there are a large mass of submissive people underneath the hierarchy of people who have knowledge or power that is bestowed unto them by God. And you can go across any culture. I mean, like China, like, what is it? Divine providence or whatever they called it in Chinese. Like they believe that heaven bestowed upon the
The
emperor
heavenly mandate.
the heavenly mandate. Thank you. Yeah. Like they believe that the heavens bestowed upon them the righteousness of power. But in reality, what was happening was they probably were just humans who were a little bit smarter, a little bit more well equipped with the resources and the connections, and that things just fell into place for somebody, however that played out. But
Right.
this is the actually the part two. If you remember earlier, I had two questions. This is the part two of the question I wanted to get after, which is, and this is question is aimed at Heidi because you've experienced this. In your opinion, the people who are ultimately in power, do they know going into that progression or that avenue of power that they're going to seize power in the way that they want to, that they have an end state in mind, that they want to achieve this? Like, oh, I'm going to go off and try to be the leader of a cult. Or do you think that there's some kind of underlying human psychology that's going at play subliminally for them, where they're just getting a little taste here, a little taste there, and they're just kind of like falling into that groove that's leading them to that down that path?
See, I don't know. I can't speak for them. I do think that there is definitely they have stuff in common, like delusions of grandeur. That's a thing. That's a real thing. And narcissism, I think even sexual deviancy, because that has to do with power as well and ruling over somebody. And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that especially the cult I grew up in was rife with sexual assault. And then even the leader, eventually Bill Gothard, he was brought down because of the accusations of what he would do with teenage girls that he'd have come and work in his office. And I've met him a few times, and he invited me. He's like, "Oh, it'd be wonderful if you come and work in the Chicago office." And I was like, "Oh, okay," And it was just in passing as he was saying hello to everybody. And I was 15. I was so fortunate, and didn't know it at the time, but know now for sure that I was so fortunate to have been a child from a divorced family, that my parents were divorced, and because of that, in the eyes of Bill Gothard and the cult, I was worth a little bit less. My diamond, my jewel, as Bill Gothard called it, was shrunken because I came from a divorced family. And so I wouldn't have actually been allowed to go and work in his offices, even if I wanted to, because I was disqualified from even being in the cult because my parents were divorced. So I was never officially a member. I was always just there with my family, my aunt and uncle, my cousins. And my dad never went, he would just send me.
So Heidi, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that your parents were divorced and your dad
Mm-hmm.
kind of had nothing to do with it. Like he didn't go to the church or anything like that, if I understand correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
How did you relay that? Well, let me rephrase the question. How did you explain that to
Yeah.
your parents when they asked about it? Did your mom have any concerns? Was she in your life?
Yes, she hated it. She did not want me to be a part of it at all. She was like, "Heidi, you used to love 17 magazine and stuff, and now you think it's evil. Like, you're talking about getting married at 18. Like, you will have just graduated from high school," which is exactly what I did. I got married at 18, just like a good godly girl was supposed to. Um, but I think my dad was, again, I can't speak for him so much, but just like guessing, I think that he was just so glad that his daughter was super interested in church and not joining a gang, which was a big deal in the mid 90s and early 2000s. I started going to church with my aunt and uncle and cousins when I was 11, and I stopped going when I was about 15 or 16. By that point, I had it. There was a few things that had happened. One of them even being in the same place. They're called training centers. They have them all over the country. They have one in Flint. I don't know if they do anymore, Flint, Michigan. But when I lived in Michigan, that's where I went to high school. I went to the training center to do high school. That was also where Bill Gothard would come and have seminars and such sometimes. So I would be there working or assisting. And I remember they had these kids that would come from Chicago, and they were called LITs, Leaders in Training. They were kids that had been released from the state of Illinois, from their custody into Bill Gothard's custody so that he could rehab them, which is crazy. Especially when you think of all the sexual stuff that comes out later. And then he would send them to the training centers so that they would be used as housekeepers. These training centers are all in old hotels. So they'd buy the hotel, or the owner of Hobby Lobby would buy the hotel because he's in the cult. Hobby Lobby is in the cult. I'm not kidding. And he bought the training center in Flint, the Radisson, and we spent weeks cleaning it out. It had, I think, 15 floors, and so I'm there just working like really hard labor and such, and just, because I'm supposed to. And one of the leaders came up and pulled me aside one day, and she's like, Heidi, there's a rumor going around that you've been to jail, or that, and I was like, what? Why? And she was like, I mean, it's because you're from a divorced family. And I was like, at that moment, it just snapped something. And I was just like, bitch, in my mind, I was like, what the fuck does what did my parents' divorce have to do with my character at all? It was like, there's a rumor going around because I'm from a divorced family that I'm also a criminal. It was like, that was real clear for me. I was the only person that I knew at my church whose parents were divorced, period. And like, it was known, and my dad didn't go to church either. So I was the only person, and I went to public school. Okay. So I went to public school. My parents are divorced, and my dad doesn't go to church. And my aunt told me this, my aunt, and another instance that happened were pretty defining and breaking me away from it as well. My aunt told me, the one who brought me to church, and I mean, she did a lot of shaming and damage. One day we were out working in her garden, again, me doing labor because I thought it was the right thing. I don't know, I was a teenager, and I think she'd noticed I had a crush on somebody at church, and so she asked me about it, and I was really embarrassed, but I was like, yeah, I do. I have a crush on him. And she's like, well, I would never let my kids marry someone from a divorced family. And I was like, okay. And she was like, they won't either. No one is going to. And I was like, why? And she was like, because you will grow up to get divorced. You will grow up to repeat your parents' sins. The sins of your father will be visited unto you into the third and fourth generation. Because your father hates God and doesn't go to church, you are worthless. And I mean, that was damaging. That was real. I think it was a real, like, a canon moment for me, But also it was something that helped me snap out of that. It was just like, I got to a place where I was like, if I have to perform and do all this shit to be acceptable to God, and he can't just accept me, like, if he can't just love me, then I don't want any part of it. Like, I don't want it.
What would have been so perfect in that moment is if you were like, well, did you know that like 1200 years ago, your ancestor smashed the skull in of a child? Like smashed you know what I mean? Like, how do you
Right.
know that somebody didn't get divorced from your family a bajillion years ago and you're doomed to repeat it too? Like, it's such a short-sighted response. Sorry, I just had to say that.
And my aunt, her brother got divorced. He was, and I remember the way she treated him too. And my mother, she's one of four. She was the only one of four who got divorced, and she was the only one of four who didn't go to college. And apparently my grandparents, my dad is very blue collar, and my mother's family are very very white collar. They did not think my dad was good enough. So, I mean, it's just been a long, long line of like, for my aunt, I think. But anyway, that really helped me break out of it. It was like, I don't want to be a part of something like this. I don't want to bend over backwards just to feel God's love. Like, why do I have to do that? I'm just a kid.
How old were you when she essentially insulted the hell out of you right there?
I think I was 14. It was before I met my ex-husband. And I met my ex-husband like a few days before I turned 15. I met him at church as well. So she said that. And I was, I mean, it wasn't like in an instant. I was like, that's it. I'm packing up and going, but that was a huge, like a really pivotal experience. Yeah. My aunt was awfully abusive, very, very abusive. So
if you're comfortable with sharing, do you mind going into what she did, not only to you, but to maybe other members?
like my sister. Yeah. Well, if we did anything, so I remember her getting angry at me for stepping on the threshold when I was walking from the hallway into my bedroom that I stayed in when I would go there on the weekends. If I stepped on the threshold, literally on the floor, and I didn't step over it and into the room, she'd lose her shit. She'd be like, "Why are you trying to destroy my house? Why can't you just walk like a normal person?" And I remember she did that and it caught my uncle. Like, he was like, "What the fuck? Like, oh shit, why is she yelling?" And he was like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you yelling at her about really stepping on a threshold?" And I was just frozen in fear. And I think like I am naturally, especially as a kid, really truly, but naturally, I think I want to please. Like, I want to do I've never been like the kind of person that was like, I'm gonna go fuck some shit up unless I'm like angry. Step on the threshold. I wouldn't, how the fuck do you even, and then she would also monitor how many squares of toilet paper I'd use. She would monitor that. She'd monitor, she had these bowls that were plastic and they were kind of like one, two, like broken into thirds, and so you could essentially pour in an amount of cereal into it, and when it reached that first line on the bowl, that was all the cereal that you got, and then it was like a splash of milk, and I was the only one she did that to, and then she would give me a shot glass and then she'd put orange juice in it, and that was what I got to drink for breakfast, but her kids had full glasses, like in full bowls, and she would do this in front of me. And even one day my cousin was like, "Mom, why don't you let Heidi eat like you let us eat?" She's like, "Just mind your own business."
I'm assuming it's because of the whole divorce thing, why she was treating you differently.
It must be. I don't know. I mean, she married into our family and she sure did talk a lot of shit about our family. I mean, she talked a lot of shit. And so I know that they did not like her. They did not want my uncle to marry her. And she was real bitter about that. And so then when my mom came along and married my dad, and then she got divorced, well, that dethroned my aunt, the most hated person.
So, two-parter. Is your aunt still alive? And do you think she uses the fact that you did get divorced as like an aha? Like, oh, I knew it. Like, do you feel like that? Because the reason I ask you is because I've had family members who are like that, where they're like, they have it in their head that something is going to happen. And it's clear to you
Yep.
that it's just the progression of things, the way they played out. You were in an abusive relationship and all that stuff, and like, or things like, happen in a way that you couldn't control, and it's not your fault. But to them,
Right.
it's still like, aha, like that's verification.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just that too. It was that we got divorced, and oh gosh, I forget the other thing. I got away from Michigan as soon as I could. I wanted to get as far away from there as and so at 18, I got married and moved to Texas, and I've never gone back. Well, I've been back to visit, but my relationship with my aunt and uncle, especially, and my cousins really broke down even before I moved. But it was, I didn't realize it was abuse. And I think as well, like I had such a desire I had such a need as a kid to be accepted and like loved and looked after. And not that my dad didn't, but he didn't. And my mom was not in the picture. And so I remember what drew me personally the most to church, period, at that time was the families. I wanted to go there and be around the families. I loved being around the families. And like, I would get so lonely by myself at home, and I was frequently by myself at home because my dad worked and my sister lived with my mother. I'd get so lonely, I would call my best friend who had siblings, and she would just put the phone on the table so that I could sit and listen to all of the noise going on in her home because I was that lonely. So I mean, it was really, that's, I think, a lot of what drove me initially into it, for sure.
So Heidi, going back to that cult, you said that you met your first husband as a part of that group.
Yes.
What was that process like? I'm assuming you wanted to get married at 18. Like, what was that whole process like within that cult itself?
Right. So they don't believe that women should go to college or have jobs outside of the home. So your education's done at high school, and you're meant to be married and to be your husband's helpmeet and to bring more Christians into the world. And that's what you're meant to do. That's what they taught us. And so there was no reason. So everyone I knew at 5, 6 people who got married at 17. You got married at 20 and you were a woman. I mean, you were like an old maid. I was like, wow, no one wanted you. And I just remember being really terrified that I wouldn't be chosen, quote unquote. And the process in our cult was that the boy or the guy would notice the girl and like her, and then he'd go to his dad and tell his dad, and then they'd pray about it, whatever the fuck. And then once his dad got some inkling from God that, yeah, this girl might be the one, then they would go together to her dad, and then he'd pray about it. And then if he decided, yeah, I think this dude's the one for my daughter, then he'd go to his wife. She'd pray about it. If she decided yes, then they'd go to the girl, and she had to pray about it and then decide. And I can't think of one that said no, because when you have all those people coming to you and like telling you, we all believe this is God's will, but yeah, you go ahead and pray and see what you think.
But I'm thinking, like, when it gets down to the actual boy or girl who's gonna marry, they're just so full of angst, and like they just want to, like, yes, I prayed on it, yes, I'm ready.
Well, you think about it, there's 17, 18-year-old boys.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they want to get
like,
laid.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
natural. Like,
So
yeah,
does
it's
the
they're at
women.
that point where like they can't control their urges. Like, of course you're gonna be like, prayed on it.
Yeah,
Yes, sold.
You mean I get to be balls deep in her? Sure. But no, they would do that, and then, they'd get married at 18, 17, 18 years old. And then, I mean, I went to many weddings, at least 5, of teenagers, and then they'd start having kids. And that's just what you're supposed to do. When I was 15, I was actually 6 days away from my 15th birthday. Oh, I have to tell you too, we had in this cult there, we had rules around boy and girl interactions. There was a 6-inch rule at all times. You had to stay 6 inches away from the opposite sex. Even when you were dating, or you didn't date, in fact, you only courted, and you only courted after all that prayer and shit. Even when you were courting, you couldn't hold hands or hug. You still had to maintain the 6-inch rule, and you didn't get to touch or hold hands or anything like that until at the altar. And actually, there's a dateline in 1997. They actually, I don't know how, but found out about our cult. They did a special on it. They did a special on the courting, and the girl's name who they did the special on, her name was Heidi, of all things. But Heidi and Chad Eves, yeah. And she was 20 when she got married, so it was like, wow, she was 3 years older than most people, which was really old. And so the cult I was in is the same cult that the Duggars are in, from 19 Kids and Counting on TLC. And they have the son who is now in prison for 12 years because he was caught with a whole bunch of child porn, and he was found guilty of raping his sisters. There is tons of incest in that family. Well, there is tons of incest in the family I married into, and there's tons of incest in that church and in the cult. It was rampant because, in my opinion, these teenage boys are getting to be that age, and not that this is acceptable at all, but then they've got these tiny little siblings and they're not allowed to even get 6 inches
Right.
away from a girl that they, and again, there is
Yeah,
no
no.
excuse at
Yeah.
all, period.
I mean, like let's be honest with
But
ourselves. Like
it's just,
we've all been teenagers. Like, come on. Like, there's in some situations when you're younger, you just cannot fight that. It's really hard. Not to say it's okay, but what you're saying is,
it's
yeah. So
unavoidable.
trying to
It just
cultivate that, or preparing for that time as opposed to blocking it off, you're potentially reducing the
yes.
likelihood of something like terrible like that happening.
It's so maladaptive. And it's like, if I have 3 children, they're all teenagers. I don't want any of them to come home. Well, actually, they're not all teenagers. Oh my God. My oldest turned 20 the beginning of the month. I have a 20-year-old now, y'all. But the other 2 are teenage. I don't want them coming home pregnant anytime soon. I don't want them coming home engaged either. I wouldn't want that. No. But what I really don't want is them so repressed that they are acting out in maladaptive ways. And I mean, the fact that there was an epidemic of it in that church. I think there was a 5-year wait for counseling. And there's the doctor's name was Dr. Logan, is the counselor, and he specialized in that. I guess he was based in Big Sandy, and
Isn't it crazy that I don't think that it's, particularly strong to say that every single situation of like societal planning and all that's like, governmental planning doesn't always work, right? But isn't it strange that when you talk about trying to be preventative with sexuality, whether it's spreading STDs or limiting pregnancy, whatever, like, isn't it crazy that like the statistical probability of lowering cases like that is done through careful planning, as opposed to saying, let's just pray over it and patient, like if it's evil, it's evil, like, yeah, exactly. Like, if you really want your kids to not get pregnant, if you really want them to not get STDs, like, how about following what people who are trying to make society better do?
But dude, it's not about making society better. The whole crux of it is control. It's someone's fetish over power and controlling other
In a
people
cult,
through any means. I'm sure the founder of it, whatever, doesn't give a fuck that there's incest or anything like that, because these fucking people are at my beck and call.
Yeah.
He got arrested for it too.
Not surprised.
They took him, right? I wasn't either. I was like, it was about time. It was about time. It was so gross. He stood like so close to my face and he said, "You have the most beautiful eyes." And he's right. I do. But that was creepy. I was 14. Like, oh, what is this old man doing?
I mean, that's not acceptable at any instance.
Yeah.
If we want to be really academic and take this perspective from a wider margin, I think the reason why we had younger marrying and all that stuff when we were like, before society really took hold, before we got to an age where we're living longer and longer, I think that like people saw the argument was like, okay, if you're young enough to conceive, then you're young enough to produce offspring. That's clearly wrong. Psychologically speaking, they're not fully developed, because we know nowadays that the brain continues to develop even into the 20s, right? So
20s. Yeah.
That was a mistake or a lack of understanding that we had, in the same way that it was like, hey, let's pit these 2 people against each other in this like death ring to get them over their strife, as opposed to like, hey, why don't we just talk it out and have a court appointed judge to, like we don't have to do the shit we did.
Maybe we shouldn't drink the water that we shit into.
We don't have
sewage separate from drinking water.
We don't have to do the shit that we did 100 years ago just because it worked.
How long has it been since child brides were a thing? Like, really?
It just doesn't work.
Ew.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, and from a historical perspective, if you look at, let's take ancient Greece for an example, the average lifespan was probably maximum of 35 years. So that's why people were getting married and having kids at age 16, 17, and 18 type of thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, like, the I guess life expectancy also informed that for
Oh,
sure.
absolutely. And I think that's why you can't really compare antiquity to now.
Yes.
I get your perspective, Dean, but from a historical perspective, going back 2,000 years, 1,000 years, the reason people got married and had kids at a very in their teens and early 20s is because the likelihood of you dying was very high,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
because not a lot of people lived in major cities. And even if you did live in a major city, I think Rome at its height had what, maybe 2 million people. A lot of
Yeah.
those people are not wealthy.
Yeah. That's fair.
They're living in
That's
slums.
fair.
You're dealing with gangs. You're dealing with the ruffians of society. You're dealing with pestilence. You're dealing with disease. You don't have,
Was it like that in Asia as well?
oh, across the board, mostly,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think there were young concubines.
But yeah, Heidi, to answer your question, like life expectancy in ancient, like China, for example, would have been in the same category, unless you were part of that group,
Mhm.
unless you're like part of the military or some sort of upper echelon of society.
Like a royal.
Yeah, that had some
Mhm.
sort of access to medicine and stuff like that. Because if you think about it, the average person did not really have access to that. You're tilling the fields all day. I'll
Yeah.
digress from the historical, and we could get back to your story. You met your first husband. You guys get
Mm-hmm.
married. After you got
Yeah.
married, was that then when you left the cult, or like what was the process of you getting married, from you getting married to you leaving?
Yeah. So we met, I was 15. We started dating. So for us, dating was writing letters to each other. And then we spent some time together. And then 3 years later, I was 18, he was 21. It was time to get married. And so I moved to Texas in August of 2003 and got married in October of the same year. And then, it was just life. Our wheels hit the pavement hard. I was already out of the cult, so to speak. Like, I was not going to my aunt and uncle's church at all anymore for a few years before I got married. Like, definitely from never after the age of 16. But I still believed in God at that point, though, very much. And I still absolutely, kept up with like daily devotions, which is reading the Bible every day, and prayer time, like dedicated prayer time. And I still really subscribe to a lot of the ideas that I was taught. And my ex-husband, his family, I think they're still in the cult, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. They were certainly in the cult the entire time I was in their family, like officially in it, paying dues, literally paying dues. But he was done with it himself, like long before we met, even. And I think he was further along in sort of renouncing it than I was when we got married. Like, I was more interested in finding a church to attend together. We didn't want to go to his parents' church. His dad is a pastor, by the way, and we didn't want to attend his dad's church for obvious reasons. But he really didn't want to. So I don't know. It took some time for me to fall away from religion completely, but it was definitely a process that happened and was completed by the time I was 26. That's for sure. I haven't believed in God for quite a while.
I think that's totally fair, because what I want to ask you is, honestly, though, like I guess this conversation was ultimately leading to this question, but do you believe anything now after experiencing all of that cultism? And if you believe anything, what do you think the likelihood of that belief is? If you're willing to share, it's totally cool if you're not comfortable sharing that.
I mean, I don't mind at all. I don't believe anything really. I don't, because the thing is that I don't know. I don't know. Like, that's the truth. I don't know. I would, I don't want to say bet my life that Jesus isn't real, but I don't think that that's what it is, guys. I don't think it is. I don't think that's gonna be it. But I don't know, and so I've just found peace existing in a space of not knowing. And I shared this last time, but it's really true. Like, for me, that being in a place of not knowing it puts me in a place of learning all the time. And I love to learn. And of course I want to learn. I don't ever, something about being in a cult too, is you're pretty locked down to that belief system. And then you end up being locked down to only those people, that's all you do. You eat, breathe, sleep it, and it's a pretty narrow world, especially for a woman, at least in the cult that I was in. And yeah, so I don't know. I don't know. I don't believe in anything, but nor would I sit there and tell someone that they're wrong about what they believe. But, when I die, I don't know. I sure as fuck hope that like my consciousness is the energy and that I have some awareness of like, my loved ones that have gone on before me and whatever. But I think for me, the other thing, one of the things that really loosened religion up for me was this idea that eternity, literally forever, could be decided on 80 years here
Yes.
on Earth.
Yeah.
Like, let's be real. Like, if eternity is forever, then in a million years, do you really think anyone's going to give a fuck about what you did in those 80
Right.
years you spent on this Earth? Like, no. And is it fair to burn in hell for that? What? For what?
That's exactly what I was saying. I think in previous podcast we said I'm totally with you. If we do have that experience where there's some higher power that does dictate whether or not we're spending a longer time in an afterlife, then that is pretty unfair. But it's possible, right? Like it's possible that could happen. But at the same time, I think more likely than not, we're in a progression of understanding where there's either nothing after this, which, I used to be afraid of that, but I'm kind of fine with that now. Like, like after all the severity and the heaviness of like eternal damnation, like if there's nothing after we're gone, I'm cool with that.
Yeah, like
but if there is something after this, I think that more likely than not, we're in a universe where there's some kind of benevolence ultimately.
Yeah.
But my brother, this is
I
where
do
we
too.
differ. And not coming from like a Catholic perspective, I think there should be punishment for horrible people. Honestly.
Sure, yeah.
There is no fucking way in my mind there should be salvation for someone like Hitler. Salvation for someone like this prick that created this cult that we're talking about today. Nothing.
Yeah.
There should be nothing for them. They should burn in fucking eternity.
No. A toilet seat in like the worst porta potty that never stops being in use for a long, long time.
Whether it be physically burning or whether it be like in some sort of loop of their worst point in their life, just constantly living it over and over again.
And I agree.
There has to be something. I'm not saying your perspective is kumbaya. To me, there can't be no fucking kumbaya. Even if there is a God that is benevolent, I view God as a parent. From the perspective of free will, you get the free will to make your own choices. And if you infringe on other people and you hurt other people, I'm sorry.
Like that,
there, you deserve to be punished the same way as you would punish.
And I think it's natural for us to feel that way, Chris. Like we feel the way you just described for a reason. Natural to feel.
Here's
angry,
my problem.
Right?
Sorry, here's my problem though with that, and I'm totally. I totally respect you guys in your belief with that. First of all, I do think that there needs to be some punishment for sure, because there's some correction, there's some correctiveness that needs to happen. But I can never conceive of a situation in which someone makes decisions on this earth that result in their permanent damnation. And the reason I say that
I agree.
is because
even Hitler,
listen,
even Genghis Khan,
listen, take Nero, Mr. Historian. We know that Nero.
Yeah, fuck Nero.
I know Nero used to throw naked boys that he had sex with from his villa off to the cliffs on the bottom and kill them.
No, that wasn't Nero. That was another one. But
sorry, what was that?
Was it Constantine?
No, it wasn't Constantine either.
Well, sorry, Chris.
It was the second emperor. It was
Tiberius. Okay, but still, almost.
Yep.
So
Tiberius.
His minnows.
So Tiberius essentially, he would do something like that. That's really awful. Like I mean, beyond words. Not even just awful, beyond words. But at the same time, there are instances where you have royalty who are born from being inbred, like we talked about recently, from like the cult experience. We all know that being inbred drives the mental capacity for somebody to be
Tiberius wasn't inbred, but go on.
You asshole. You know what
I'm
I'm
not,
getting.
dude. I'm a
Okay, okay, okay,
classicist.
okay.
I'm a classicist.
You know what I'm. You know what I'm
So
getting.
if you want to use a different example, go
You know what
ahead.
I'm getting after, though, right? Like there were instances in history where somebody was inbred and they made decisions based off of a lack of mental capacity. So
Okay.
it wasn't their fault they were inbred, right? But it was their fault. It was their fault that
Yeah.
they did make these terrible decisions. But at the
Yeah.
same time, like, what ability did they have to make those decisions? But what I'm saying is, honestly, like, some people have a proclivity, but like at the same time, it's just like how do we measure that? How do we?
So I can say, like, I don't want to be like flippant and be like, I don't care about Hitler. I hope that dude is suffering so bad right now.
So Heidi, I know we kind of went off on a little other discussion about, damnation, but listeners, Dean had to drop off. So Heidi and I will continue the conversation. And Heidi, I wanted to circle back to you leaving the cult. So
Mm-hmm.
did your husband leave with you? Did you face any challenges or threats when you were trying to like leave the general area? Did anyone try to convince you to come back?
His parents were pretty unhappy with our choice to stop going to church. So my ex-husband, by the time we got married, and he was 21, by the time we got married, he was pretty much done with religion at that point. I think I don't know what he'd say he believes now, but I know that by the time we got divorced 9 years later, 9 years after we got married, he either didn't believe in God completely, or he really was like, I don't know, probably, but I don't know. So he was kind of ahead of me in that. We started having kids, especially. His parents really, there was a lot of resistance in them that we weren't going to church, and what's going to happen to our kids' souls, and having to pray. My ex mother-in-law praying for setting my youngest on her lap to pray for his soul, and him telling me like, Mom, am I gonna go to hell? And he was a 3, and just because we hadn't told him that, and why would we? And so yeah, we definitely faced some of that and some backlash on that, and we really had to put our foot down over and over again, like, we don't teach them this, so you don't either. Like, we won't allow them to come over anymore if you don't stop. And then they did stop being, proselytizing to our kids. By the time I got married when I was 18 and was in Texas, we were out of the cult, but we were still going to a Baptist church, a very popular one here in Austin. That probably stopped completely. Yeah, by the time I was like 24, 25.
So am I correct in assuming that like you and your husband kind of were of the same of mind? Okay, these people are bad shit. We got to get the fuck out of here.
We never talked about
No.
it. I wish we would. No, we didn't. No, it was not a very good marriage. He was super, super checked out. For me, I can say, for me, the end of my quote unquote faith is what a Christian would say. I lost my faith after my ex-husband beat me up when I was 5 months pregnant with our youngest child. And I spent 4 days in the hospital because of that. And instead of holding him accountable and, X, Y, and Z, because certainly that wasn't the first time that he had done that, they came at me like, well, have you been keeping the house clean? Are you cooking? Like, are you having sex with him when he wants? And it was like, yeah, all of that, this, and when they put it back on me so hard, I remember feeling somehow in that way, I felt betrayed by God. I just felt I was like, I've been so devout, and then this happens, like, I'm sick of it. I'm done. I literally had no more emotional space for God anymore. And it wasn't like I didn't believe in him anymore at that point. I don't anymore completely, but I had no more emotional space or bandwidth for Christianity or my Bible or any of it. It just literally overnight, like, I came home from the hospital after that 4 days and I never touched my Bible again.
I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I'm really,
Thank you.
really sorry. No one should have to go through that.
I agree.
It's, listening to someone tell this story, this is stuff you hear like on a Netflix documentary type of stuff.
Mm.
And then here we are, like, actually talking to someone that experienced all of this maltreatment and
Mhm.
indoctrination, and here you still are chugging along,
Yeah.
doing the best that you can do.
Yeah.
So kudos to you, like, honestly,
Thank you.
honestly.
My name is Heidi. I am a mountain. I will not be moved.
So earlier in the podcast, you did mention there was some sort of correlation or relation to the Duggars. Could you go into that a little bit if you're comfortable?
Totally. Yeah. Like the Duggars, so 19 kids and counting, they're in the same cult. So the reason why the Duggars have 19 kids and why my ex husband was the oldest of 11 children is because of the teachings of the cult directly. They taught that you had to very blessed was the man who had a quiver full of kids, a quiver full. So like your kids are your arrows. I can't believe how many sermons I've sat through that have encouraged people to have kids, because then you can use the kids as an arrow. Literally, you can weaponize your kid um, as the arrow from your quiver. But I'm not kidding. That's what it is. But then also, literally, we were taught that we had to have as many kids as possible so that we could outbreed the Muslims specifically. And of course, we supported the Jews in whatever they did because we were Judeo Christian and very like fundamentalist, like Abrahamic. And so we really believed that, every single person who was Jewish was a chosen person of God, and like, we needed to protect them and whatever at all costs, which still, I mean, they're, needs that. But we were supposed to outbreed Muslims. And so the my ex-husband's family and the Duggars in this cult, once a year you have to make a pilgrimage either to Knoxville, Tennessee, or to Big Sandy, Texas, for what they call the advanced training. And that lasts for, I think, 10 or 11 days, and the entire family goes and you attend a whole bunch. I've never been because I was never an official member of the cult. I was never allowed to go. But my ex-husband's family certainly did. And that is where my ex-husband's mom met Mrs. Duggar and hit it off. This is like the year before their show came out or something. And so that when they came back the next year to Big
I
Sandy,
feel dirty
the
with the
Duggars
fact
were
that I
there.
actually watched that show for a couple episodes.
I've never watched it. I've never
It's
watched it.
crap. Don't watch it.
Well, I don't want to. I lived it,
Yeah, that
right?
too.
I mean, and that's why I haven't watched like the Netflix documentary about the Duggars yet either. I just can't. I don't want to. I just no. But anyway, yeah, my ex-husband's family were on an episode of the Duggars because they were at that conference together. There's just a ton of similarities between the Duggars and my ex-husband's family. I mean, that they're in the same cult, that they're wealthy, they're powerful. One of the member, I mean, I know it was Mr. Duggar who was a member, I think, of, what was he, a state rep? And now it's one of their daughters is a state rep, here in Texas. And then the incest and such, just.
So before we started recording, you did mention there was some sort of type of Christian nationalism that was
Yeah.
pushed forward in these groups.
And I think that it's kind of becoming more mainstream, the Christian nationalism. At least it seems like it is here in Texas. And, my ex sister-in-law, who is now literally a lawmaker here, a state representative, and is married to the lieutenant governor's chief of staff. So, I mean, deeply entrenched in the politics here. And if you go to her Twitter or her X, I mean, that's all it is. I mean, she's so out and open, and she's putting it out there, like literally Bible verses, and speaking directly about God and Christianity specifically. It's not just her, but then other lawmakers are like retweeting it and such. That to me, and that's not to me, that is Christian nationalism strongly right now. And it's crazy because it's like, y'all, do you understand like the origins? Like what my ex sister-in-law was raised in, that is the dirt that her beliefs have been growing in. Like,
And I have the last couple of questions here for you, Heidi. And
mhm.
I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
not something that's easy to talk about, and we really appreciate that. Final questions that I have for you is, what
Mhm.
advice would you give to someone that's in a similar situation that you were in at that time,
At which
back
time?
when you were in that cult and dealing with that whole situation?
I don't know because I think the power of the cult is that you're brainwashed. No one could tell me anything, like not even my own mom, like could have talked me away from it. Um, I don't know what advice I'd have for somebody who was me. I don't know what I would do, what I would say to myself if I went back. I think I would just scoop myself up in my arms and hug myself and try. I think that I was especially susceptible to it because, like, when by the time I was 10 or 11, like my dad was done raising me. I was old enough to do housework and do the dishes and such, and I really kind of raised myself after that. And so I don't know. I think I would just try to invest in that kid more, and draw them away. I had so many other um, things I wanted to do and pursue as a kid before I got taken over by the cult. Like I loved singing, I still do, and I sang the whole time. I was in choirs and everything, and not just at church either, like at school and things, and played an instrument. And I loved theater. Like I had a whole, I wanted to be a lawyer, and all that got washed away. So I think that if someone had just invested a little more in that in me, then I could have been led away from the cult.
Yep, that's completely
You know what I mean?
understandable.
It's kind of personal answer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get so
No,
personal about
no,
it,
no.
but
It's, no need to apologize for that. It was kind of a personal question, just geared towards you.
I mean that's just I can only really relate to myself,
Right.
right? Like I can't. Right. And so like I was a kid going through it, and I think that had my dad not been so negligent, I wouldn't have gotten so deep into it, to be perfectly honest.
And one last question for you, Heidi, before I let you
Mhm.
go. Again, I appreciate your
Yeah.
time today. So,
Yes,
like,
yes.
after dealing with all that, and in the previous podcast, you shared paranormal experiences and other personal life experiences.
Mhm.
How do you motivate yourself to just keep moving forward? And
My children, if I didn't have my kids, I don't even know. Like they're genuinely it has been a struggle. I don't know. It's just a day at a time, even now. I wish I had a better answer, but it's a very good therapy. I think therapy is super important. And I have always stayed curious, I guess, has been one of the things. Like I've always just had the sense like this isn't over. This isn't over yet. I don't know how I do it.
no,
Sorry.
no, you're good. You're good.
I feel grateful to be here. I think as well, part of what keeps me going is I had a family member who, committed suicide when I was a really young girl, and that really shaped our upbringing. My father's brother, he was so sad. So I've always had it in me that like no matter how hard it gets, you just have to keep going because killing yourself would really make everybody sad.
No,
So
that's a fair way to look at it. It doesn't have to be
yeah.
complex. It could just be literally that.
That's really what it kind of comes down to sometimes. So,
But Heidi, I want to thank you again for coming on the
yeah,
show. I really appreciate
thank
it,
you for
and I appreciate your time. You taking the time
having me.
to share these heavy stories with us. I had planned to do like deep dive episodes on, the darker side of religion.
Yeah,
So I want to say again, thank you for being on the show. We really, really
you're so
appreciate
welcome.
you sharing your story.
Sorry I couldn't be lighter. I'm not sure it'll ever be light with me on here.
No, no, it doesn't have to be. You listen to some of the crap that we put out.
I sure
Yeah.
do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we talk about
yeah.
true crime and, H Holmes like cutting people up and all that stuff. So it's never
Right?
really light. I don't even know if we've ever
I
had a light.
know. His name is H. Holmes, and I'm like, hey, my initials are HH. Like, get off. I remember that. But like that's the thing, like you just have other things in life that you're interested in, you know. It's like, well, I'm literally gonna avoid thinking of this sad thing and I'll just focus on this YouTube video I'm watching right now or something, you
Right.
know. It's like you just make it.
But again, thank you, Heidi. Listeners,
You're welcome.
if you want to be on the show, like Heidi was today, to share your paranormal experiences, or if you have a unique, strange, dark, whatever experience that you want to share, please reach out to us at our email address at twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on social media, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Pop us a message. We'll love to have you. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. It was a little bit of a heavy one, but thank you for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please share the show with your friends, as that would help us grow immensely. Also be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on TikTok at twrpodcast, our Instagram at twroadpodcast, and our Facebook by searching for The Wandering Road Podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can reach us at our email address, twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We would love to have you on the show as a guest so you can share your stories, or you could submit email submissions of your stories that we could dedicate an episode to. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one.